Good afternoon, everyone. Actually, in the African American church, when you say good afternoon, the audience says, good afternoon. So I'll try that again, good afternoon. It's part of the history of call and response, and I think part of traditions of Black space making, where the challenges of claiming space, for many reasons, were limited. So spaces were clearly made through events, through gatherings, and I think that was a way of sort of claiming space. So I am honored and humbled to share my work and ideas with an esteemed group from around the globe. I think this will be a really amazing conversation today that will continue what we started, I think, this morning. But I also just wanted to thank everyone, Andrew, David, Sam, Venetia, Naomi, for pulling all of this together. I mean, it's really a remarkable undertaking on some very kind of critical and important issues that we often in the design world don't think about because we're just pushing to get the deadline. Okay, so I wanted to talk about future reckoning. This year's Living City Forum asked us to consider future needs, an apt query in the face of devastating climate change, growing economic inequality, the toxic rise of populism within liberal democracies, and global mass migrations that have now displaced more than 65 million people. So this year, I think the forum provoked us to think deeply by asking, quote, if architecture and urban design always take place in the future, with designed products taking years or even decades to meet the ground, then we must consider the needs of future people and environments when designing for the city. Precise calculation and open imagination are required, end quote. So do future needs, as the forum asks, outweigh the opportunities of the present day? And clearly we heard this morning, absolutely not. This is really important, I think, as Andrew just said, to think about what's directly under our feet. So how might we consider that important question with the following caveat? Can we imagine future needs that also address the lack of opportunities, structural inequalities of the present day, ones that are consequences of the past? So, I mean, if you're of a certain age, you recognize where this image came from. But it's a push me, pull you. And I was going to do a Janice face, but I was like, nah, I think this kind of gets it. More the kind of tension between past and present. So certainly speculating about the future is integral to the prospective nature of architecture. We as architects and designers spend our days envisioning what is to be in the world. But architecture also has a retrospective dimension. We work, for instance, with precedents, typologies, and contexts. As Rajaporn, I think, and Glenn showed us this morning, what pre-existed on a site, what typologies come from where, histories of the land are really important for how we work. These might be local histories, global histories, many are in fact colonial histories. So architects always conceptualize the future, but it is always from the present and in relation to the past. So certainly change has always been one of the forces, both ideological and material, that has made the world modern, or as we academics like to say, modernity. So in the 19th century, progress became, as I will talk more in detail, the engine of industrialization. Progress was important to nationalism. Progress fueled white settler colonialism of social betterment. Progress was the rationale for ending slavery and the slave trade. Progress was the key to better housing, better transportation. I think Christopher showed us what that meant in terms of evolution, but also better health and better cities. However, do we as designers and architects peer so far into the future that our starting point, the now, which is formed as a consequence of past needs, previous decisions, old deeds in need of redress, is conveniently forgotten in an effort to construct our next utopia? So to the eyes of German philosopher Walter Benjamin, by the 1930s, post-World War I, progress had already left a debris field in its wake. Of the angel of history, Benjamin observed, quote, "His face is turned toward the past, where we perceive a chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. The storm is what we call progress," end quote. So if we gaze into the past in all of its horrors, Benjamin reflected on the eve of the Second World War, will it propel us toward the future we desire, or perhaps even need? So if we think about future needs in relation to where we are now and have been, taking stock of past needs, then our imagination might hold the seeds for a future that is just and is equitable. Because I live and work primarily in the United States, my talk this afternoon will draw from my current research, scholarly work I'm doing, but also my design practice. But as the work of artists Todd Gray and Jubelani Delmani, who's a South African artist, show us, national identities are unstable precisely because of the displacement and placement of peoples had been integral to the 500-year-long history of European colonial project of building empire. So thus there will be, I hope, many useful intersections in what I'm about to present with local histories that can prompt discussion. Reckoning with dispossession. If history was a mark of civilization in the canon of Western progress, then how do we reckon with the legacy of how the African, the indigenous, and a host of colonial others were labeled primitive, savage, and backwards as a means of dehumanization and a validation of their exploitation? How and where does one remember contested histories, such as that of slavery in the US, whose evidence has been deliberately destroyed, or whose recollection may still be too painful or difficult? What are the future forms of redress that might set right, repair, and make amends? Reckon. The productive working of the land to yield the fruits of one's labors were essential to ownership for John Locke, who rooted the notion of property in personhood. Quote, he said, "Yet every man has property in his own person," end quote. So the Western concept of self-possession, I am my own person, also writes the notion of property ownership, the fact that that person can then also own things. Rightful owners, the saying in the US that possession is 9/10 of the law, alludes to the power of possession. Rightful owners are the ones who have clear legal claims to own something, or in the past, someone. For legal scholar Cheryl Harris, quote, "The origins of property rights in the United States are rooted in racial domination," end quote. Harris writes that, quote, "White possession and occupation of land was validated and therefore privileged as the basis of property rights," end quote. 500 years of violent forced removal of Native Americans from wide swaths of the continent so that these territories could be surveyed, parceled, and sold as property by state and private interests ensured that white settlers would gain in wealth and grow in number. That is a manifest destiny. So here we see Gast, who painted the myth of progress in the 19th century. The incremental expansion of the US westward, promoted by the symbolized feminine virtue of whiteness and settlement as destiny, and rail communication as civilizing, was the future in the mid-19th century for many. But for millions of indigenous people represented as racialized and historicized, and these are those who are disappearing into the darkness of the left side of the painting, could no longer lay claim to land that they, in the minds of the US government, land speculators and white settlers, had failed to improve. That's the logic of making the claim. You must improve the land. They were dispossessed. So the exclusive right to own, mine, not yours, is sustained by the law and defended through state-sanctioned enforcement. In other words, property ownership validates power and also state sovereignty. So today, white entitlement in the US continues to unfurl its tentacles of greed and dispossession as corporations, now granted the rights of citizens in the United States by the United States Supreme Court, continues to dispossess land from indigenous nations for the sake of pipelines, drilling, and mining. In many instances still treated as non-citizens, Native Americans occupy territories outside of the nation state. Expropriated land and labor built the colonial empires, wealth, and power of the United States. Catherine McKittrick, who's a geographer, reminds us that the project of colonization created spaces, architectural and urban, where Native Americans and Black Americans have routinely been placed or displaced. This power was implemented to control and dehumanize, but also to make profit. So in his series called Of Length and Measures, Prison and the American Landscape, photographer Stephen Torrentis takes measure. He asks us to reckon with the cost of mass incarceration in the United States. The United States has 1/4. We are 5% of the world's population, but we have 1/4 of the world's prison population. Torrentis strategically shoots the exteriors of prisons at night in order to capture the radiant glow of high-intensity LED lights that render the facility grounds visible to the armed guards on night duty. The 24/7 mechanistic incarceration of primarily Black and brown bodies produces in its wake a sublime illumination that lights up the night skies in cities and slices across rural horizons. Torrentis' photographs also echo the aesthetics and themes found in 19th century paintings in the American landscape, like the one I just showed you by Gast, particularly the dualities of social progress and expropriation evoked in these large canvases. The luminous glow of the high-powered lamps in Torrentis' landscapes, however, signify the securing of the borders of American towns, homes, and businesses through decades of internal wars on drugs, followed by the tough-on-crime policies and what Mike Davis has called the benefits of carceral Keynesianism. Prisons, like this one in Florence, that are privately owned but run by the state, have revived the economies of small towns like Florence, Arizona, built on the land of the Udnam, that's the indigenous people. But at the same time, it's prisons like these in Florence that have destroyed Native American and local Chicano communities who have become generationally enmeshed in networks of mass incarceration. So how do we reckon with wasted time and wasted bodies in the aftermath of dispossession? Reckoning with enslavement. No longer desirous of living under a king who bestowed status via title, Anglo-North American colonists fought a war against the British Crown, the American Revolution, to be able to collectively self-govern as independent citizens. They wanted to be self-possessed, no longer possessed or being the subject of the monarchy. The US Constitution, however, did not define who was a citizen when it was ratified in 1789. Perhaps this was because who became a citizen of the recently formed nation was self-evident to the mostly white, male, cisgendered landowners who crafted the US legal and governmental framework. Landed property was a prerequisite to have the right to vote in elections. But with white Europeans eager for land and opportunity arriving at the shores of the new nation, it was necessary for US lawmakers to define eligibility criteria and a process toward becoming a citizen. So they passed the Naturalization Act of 1790. And this determined, quote, and this is directly from that act, that any alien being, a free white person, who shall have resided within the limits and under the jurisdiction of the United States for the term of 2 years may be admitted to become a citizen, end quote. So to possess those rights, and the title of citizen was clearly written to law as a white-only privilege. But at the same time, the majority of Africans living in the newly founded United States, where they were in some regions half the population, were legally titled property. They held none of the rights of citizen because, as it was argued, their subhuman mental capacity disallowed reason. It was believed that their inferior mental abilities and childlike nature made them suitable for work in the vast fields of tobacco, wheat, rice, and eventually cotton that fueled the wealth of the young nation. Part myth, part aspiration, Samuel Jennings' painting, and it's interesting that Jennings paints this, he was actually British, but had moved to the US, paints this in 1792, so roughly exactly at the same time the Congress was determining who could be citizen. So Jennings' painting of Clio, goddess of wisdom, or liberty, chains at her feet, she has the Phrygian cap on the post as a freed slave, draws upon her wisdom of philosophy, agriculture, painting, heraldry, mechanics, cartography, and astronomy as the liberatory promise of enlightenment. This is the library of knowledge. This promises freedom from tyranny. What's interesting always for me in the painting is how the neoclassical architecture becomes the setting for her act of freeing enslaved Africans, clearly a statement toward abolition. But we see jubilant groups of former slaves dancing around a liberty pole in nature. They are clearly outside of that realm of rationality. And they await, and you see in the background, ships for recolonization back to regions of West Africa. So this whole colonization movement led to the formation in the US of Liberia and in the UK of Sierra Leone. The enslaved joy, however, painted over the brutal scars of the master's whip, and that joyous music muffled the desperate cries of rape. The United States' 400 years of slave codes, followed by Jim Crow segregation, have laid a firm groundwork for legislating where Black people belonged. Enslaved Africans belonged in the field, not the big house. Black commuters belonged in the back of the bus, but not the front. Black residents belong in public housing, but not the suburbs. This is the point I think that Christopher was making early on this morning. Black workers belonged with their hands on a broom, not at the head of the boardroom table. The legacy of those individual actions, corporate practices, state policing, and legal dictates can be found in the racially segregated landscape of neighborhoods and cities across the US. Anti-Black racism not only robs Black people of their dignity and personhood, but also of their right to belong. In terms of power, anti-Black racism robs Black Americans of their citizenship. Now, in the US recently, and you may have heard this on the news, there have been a spate of incidents, almost daily, where white Americans have called law enforcement on Black Americans who engaged in the criminal acts of sitting in a cafe, napping in a common area of a dormitory, walking a stroller in a public park, or exercising at a gym. One blogger, Michael Harriot, recently quipped that the aforementioned incidents exposed how Black Americans are routinely prosecuted for, quote, the possession of blackness with the intent to exist, end quote. This constant barrage of racist intimidation at its most extreme, resulting in the inhumane taking of black life by paranoid police officers and white vigilantes. I'm thinking here, as the video shows, the murders of Trayvon Martin, Philando Castile, Sandra Bland, or Eric Gardner, who were all killed in the everyday acts of inhabiting public spaces in America, continues the historical practices that have disenfranchised Black people of their right to liberty, life, free movement, and even property. So the video, which I'm showing, Immobility in the Afro-Imaginary, was done with my Global Africa Lab collaborator, Mario Gooden. In it, we explore the future of Black neighborhoods under the specter of gentrification and redevelopment in New York City, where we live and work. Contemporary transportation routes in New York City, like the Cross Bronx Expressway, stand as monuments to the vicious policies of slum clearance in the 1950s through the 1970s that are steeped in the reinforcement of racial segregation and urban community displacement. I mean, it was remarkable when we were actually doing the video, trying to understand when roads were cut and how they were cut. It was extraordinary to watch, the sort of arc of development, but also urban renewal in terms of eradicating often Black and brown neighborhoods. So the video simultaneously explores the many ways that, on one hand, the Black Lives Matter protests, marches, and movements claimed and reterritorialized urban infrastructures of highways, streets, bridges, and plazas that has served as an urban apparatus of Black and brown dispossession in the 20th century. While in protest of the violent and deadly confrontations with police officers and white supremacists, Black Lives Matter protests are not only stopping traffic, but to the chance of shut the whole system down, so they're not only chanting shut the whole system down, but they're strategically disrupting the flow of people and goods that feed the metro area's billion-dollar global economy. And so the image on the left, you can start to see, with the advent of automobility, the creation of roadways. And over time, you'll start to see the sort of acceleration of that. And then on the right, we were looking at the ways in which Black Lives Matters protested started to take over these streets, boulevards, and highways that were the outcome of what you're actually seeing on the left side of the screen. And so you'll see at the end a series of collages. This was part of a workshop that we actually did for this project, which is part of an exhibition called African Mobilities. The subtitle is "This is Not a Refugee Camp," that was shown at the Architecture Museum in Munich. And as part of that, we were with collaboratives from Lagos, Kinshasa, Harare, Johannesburg, Kampala, and we all had to do workshops. And so what you'll see at the end of the image on the right are some of the collages that we worked through. And so by appropriating images of urban detritus, architectural elements, and consumer culture, the collages we worked on with our workshop, in the spirit of the Afro-Imaginary, a futurity of possibility rather than death, reinvent contested sites of redevelopment and gentrification in New York City.
Most Melbourne cities now are engaged in something called urban renewal, which means moving Negroes out. Get it? It means Negro renewal. That is what it means. And the federal government is an accomplice to this fact.
reckoning with difficult histories. 2 years ago, I served on an advisory committee to the mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, now running for president, big mistake, to develop a set of protocols to address future disputes over hundreds of monuments residing on municipal land. Along with that task, we, and I'm saying here, these were educators, artists, heads of various organizations around the city, including of the High Line, the World Wildlife Fund. There were also many public administrators. I think, as Christopher showed, these projects and lands are complicated in terms who has jurisdiction over others. But we, as a commission, were charged with reviewing 4 monuments in Manhattan that had controversial representations connected to the history and violence of slavery, Native American genocide, and the Holocaust. So along with the protocols, we had to review these 4 sites, which you can see on the map. Now, the introductory statement of our report conveys our commitment, and this is part of what we had to debate and formulate, quote, our commitment to historical reckoning, a nuanced understanding of the complicated histories we inherited. Due to the various time periods and methods of its assembly, New York City's current collection of monuments and markers celebrates some histories and erases others. So we determined, for example, that J. Marion Sims, who some people refer to as the father of modern gynecology, but many of the techniques that he developed, he practiced on enslaved women's bodies without the use of anesthesia that was available at the time. We voted to remove that statue as an outcome of actually decades-long of public protests, particularly in the community of East Harlem, near where the statue had been placed. So Sims went. However, the statue by James Earl Fraser of Theodore Roosevelt, who was US president, conservationist, but also founder of the American Museum of Natural History. And this was a statue, interestingly enough, done in the 30s, not when Roosevelt died, but much, much later. Depicts Roosevelt, an equestrian statue, very heroic, with on one side a Native American with his gun pointed down, and on the other side, African, not African-American, African with the rifle pointing up, which is a narrative of colonial conquest. And there have been, for many years, protests asking to remove this. The commission actually was at a deadlock. I voted for removal or placing it elsewhere, perhaps even within the museum itself. And then Mayor de Blasio decided the vote that it not be removed. But nonetheless, our deliberations were contentious at times, and this confirmed in my mind that the public domain was indeed a site of power, but also a public space of contestation, spaces where reckoning and redress are possible. I think another timely example of the challenges of reckoning, of addressing difficult history, is the controversy surrounding Confederate monuments in the US. A little of the back history. The Confederate States of America lost a 4-year civil war against the US government to retain its right to own enslaved Africans, which were valued at the time more than all of the real estate in the South. So that was very, very valuable property. Yet, despite the Confederacy's violent and devastating defeat, thousands were killed, cities razed to the ground. White Southerners sought to bestow labor and valor upon their dead soldiers and leaders. So to invent victory from the jaws of defeat, they remembered the Civil War as their lost cause in a host of monuments, museum, and commemorative sites. And so you could see in the orange, those were the states that were part of the Confederacy. And they clearly host the majority, but you could see that there are Confederate monuments actually around the country. And again, the myth of the lost cause becomes animated in the collective consciousness of the US in D.W. Griffith's famous Birth of a Nation. So civic organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, founded in 1894, clearly some 30 years after, 40 years actually after the war ended, 30 years after the war ended, erected thousands of monuments to Civil War soldiers and generals. Their monuments and others, some recently put into place, grace, or some would say disgrace, courthouses, town squares. They're the names of schools, they're commemorative plaques, statuaries appear on college grounds around the country, but as you could see, they're mostly in the South. So in my mind, these aren't really Confederate monuments, since they were erected after the war and the Confederacy lost. They are in fact American monuments to the legacy of anti-Black racism. Now, some of these monumental ambitions were implemented at the scale of urban design, as in the case of Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, which was the former capital of the Confederacy. The current mayor of Richmond has convened a commission and launched an ideas competition to address the contentious Grand Boulevard punctuated with the heroic statues of Confederate war generals and leaders. And you see here Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, literally the President Jefferson Davis all the way on the right. Interesting enough, because it's been so problematic for so long, in 1997, as a gesture of redress, the city placed a statue of Black tennis player and Richmond native Arthur Ashe at the end of the pantheon of Confederate heroes. Yet, despite its clear racist symbolism, Monument Avenue was named in 2007 as one of the 10 great streets in the country by the American Planning Association. This in a city that once served as a major port in the transatlantic and domestic slave trade. So these Confederate monuments were also placed on the grounds of universities. In nearby Charlottesville, Virginia, at the University of Virginia, dozens of protesters in September of 2017, and the protesters included students and faculty and local residents, engaged in an act of civil disobedience by wrapping the figure of Thomas Jefferson, of President Thomas Jefferson, in a black plastic bag and draping a Black Lives Matter, and you can't see it, but it also said "Fuck White Supremacy" banner at the statue's marble base. Thomas Jefferson, who was an American president, he was also an architect and a slave owner, founded the public university near his home in Monticello in 1817 to promote education as the foundation for the preservation of freedom in the US. What the protesters, the Black Lives Matter protesters, demanded was for the university's administration to renounce the institution's historical connections with racist individuals and groups by removing 2 Confederate plaques, memorial plaques affixed to the rotunda's south entrance, as well as publicly acknowledging a 1921 $1,000 donation from the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, a notorious white nationalist group, and take that money and reinvest it in a fund to aid victims of a deadly protest that had occurred 1 month earlier. So here that's where the plaques were affixed. Now, the removal of the plaques happened after a series of violent protests in Charlottesville that were prompted by the city government's decision to remove statues honoring generals, the Confederate generals Lee and Jackson. And so there was a blue ribbon report done locally in Charlottesville. This report actually was a model for what we did in New York City, but it was very explicit about the connection of race and local heritage and the public sphere. They demanded these 2 statues be removed, the parks be renamed. And it's clear because these were put up in the 1920s, long after the end of the Civil War, and you could see in the image that white stripe in the postcard is the KKK. So it was clear, and Robert McIntyre, who funded the statues, was a noted white nationalist. So on the first night of the rampage of their protests, the Unite the Right, A group of 100 white nationalists led a torch-lit parade through the university's historic grounds, an ominous reenactment of KKK night marches. The violently and deadly march in downtown Charlottesville left one anti-racist counter-protester, Heather Heyer, dead. Reckoning necessitates taking stock of silent histories, ones that are often painful and also difficult. Reckoning with the afterlife of slavery. So can the typologies of the modern monument, the obelisk, the triumphal arch, the equestrian statue, the historical plaque, a wall with names, suffice as an adequate medium to remember the lives of those who have been oppressed, like those who've been enslaved? The double bind of liberty and bondage was central to Thomas Jefferson's neoclassical designs for UVA. 10 pavilions to house faculty and family, rooms to board 125 male students, the verdant lawn that's in the middle, and the rotunda, the centerpiece ensemble of the ensemble that housed the university's library. In his plans for the academical village, Jefferson brought together an exclusive community in an environment conducive, as he wrote, to, quote, to health, to study, to manners, morals, and order, end quote. But what until recently had remained silent in the official historical narratives about the university's antebellum period from 1817 to the end of the Civil War in 1865 was a mention of the village's dependency, and here are some of the designs, the famous pavilions, and here we see that space of the lawn, but note, just in the corner. So what was lost and not mentioned, essentially silence, was the village's dependency on an equal number of enslaved men, women, and children who built and worked and lived at the university. So thus, while in Jefferson's educational Eden, its white residents embarked on a daily journey of personal enlightenment and communal engagement, whose material needs were satisfied by the labor of slaves. But for the enslaved, their daily routine unfolded under the regulatory authority of slave codes that severely curtailed mobility and rights, sometimes with violence. So in his designs, Jefferson carefully calibrated vistas throughout the grounds of the university to strategically hide spaces where slaves labored, who worked in illuminated kitchens below and lived in quarters below the pavilions, and behind each pavilions in what are now gardens, behind these snaking serpentine walls, were places where you find the wash house or the smokehouse. The slaves lived under the constant threat of violence at any time from any white person on or off grounds that ensured unyielding obedience. So while we can know at his nearby home, Monticello, on the morning of Monday, July 31st, 1809, Jefferson feasted on a breakfast of, quote, tea, coffee, excellent muffins, hot wheat, cornbread, cold ham, and butter, that's quite a meal, end quote, giving him the robust constitution that allowed him to live until the age of 83, to be immortalized in hundreds of statues and monuments around the world, we know almost nothing about the slaves who built the university. It was, after all, mostly enslaved workers who did the back-breaking work of digging the clay, filling the molds, and firing the bricks for an estimated 1.2 million bricks for the rotunda. And it is on a few of the original bricks, now on view in a vitrine in an exhibition in the basement galleries of the rotunda, where careful visitors can see the handprints of the enslaved worker. So unlike the detailed statue of Jefferson, the handprint leaves a very different symbolic register of the 4,000 men, women, and children who labored and lived at the academic village. These slight indentations, accidental traces of a life enslaved, have in many ways become an improbable memorial. So Freedom Ring is a memorial to enslaved laborers at the University of Virginia, and it wrestles with many of these questions in an effort to create a physical place of remembrance and a symbolic acknowledgement by the university of its difficult history. I work with an amazing collaboration that includes Mijin Yoon and Eric Howler of Howler and Yoon, a landscape architect, Greg Bleem, an environmental mediator and local activist, Frank Dukes, who actually served on the Blue Ribbon Commission in Charlottesville, and a Brooklyn-based artist Eto Tigbe. And so we thought very carefully about the materiality of the brick. And you could see it's sited just north and east of the rotunda. It's the same dimension as the rotunda. And I'll show this. So needless to say, this has been, there we go, an undertaking to grapple with and redress the past wrongs that took a large number of us collaborating to conceptualize and in fact now build the memorial. It's under construction and should be completed by March 2020. We've worked closely with administrators, faculty, staff, students, alumni, and more important, community residents, many of whom are the descendants of those who've been enslaved, but nonetheless still hold a great deal of animosity to the university because of the legacy of not acknowledging of its own history. So we've been committed collectively to the underlying mission that this be a memorial capable of addressing and perhaps even redressing the sort of complex history of slavery and anti-Black racism at the university, and by extension, the nation. So to conclude, monuments, domestic courtyards, public spaces, streets, neighborhoods, museums, and university campuses, all of these are elements of the built environment. And were all part of my talk that were characterized as sites of dispossession and also sites of oppression. Why not? As habitus, architecture shapes our daily habits. It is here with us, it is around us. When we sleep and as we wake. Ubiquitous, the built environment, then, is a perfect medium of incremental subjection. And at times, it's a physical and a psychological violence raged in the realm of the everyday. It is often asked of us, with expertise in the fields of architecture and planning, could we build spaces that were less oppressive and more humanized? With the fact that at a planetary scale, climate change, income inequality, the racist underpinnings of populism in many nations, and global mass migrations impact poor communities and people of color the greatest, in the future, we will need to reckon with the past. Thank you.